Hello, everyone. My name is Cardenas, Iniguez, and I'm an assistant professor at the University of Southern California. And today I want to talk to you about responsible data use and ethical considerations when using the ABCD study, a topic that's become increasingly important as we enter this new era of open, large-scale neuroscience data. Before we begin, I want to share 3 key learning goals, or things that I hope that you will be able to walk away with after seeing this lecture. First, the hope is that you will be able to design more rigorous ABCD study analyses by prioritizing direct measurement of environmental factors over demographic proxies and be able to justify all methodological choices with clear theoretical rationale. Second, I hope that you'll be able to communicate research findings responsibly using precise, asset, or strength-based language that accurately represents social categories and their relationship to health outcomes. And finally, I hope that you'll be able to implement accountability practices, including transparent reporting of sample composition, limitations, and ongoing self-assessment of research practices. Also, before we begin, I just want to acknowledge and recognize a few people. So a lot of the work that I'll be talking about today has been featured in this publication that I authored alongside Maribel Robledo Gonzalez, whose picture you can see up there, in a paper in Nature Neuroscience, in which we talked about a number of recommendations that we hoped researchers would be able to implement when discussing race and ethnicity in neuroimaging research. So although there's a lot of things that we talk about here that are mentioned in the paper, there's a lot of new things too, so definitely stay tuned. I also would like to give a super huge shout out to Rebecca Huber and Daniel Lopez, as they've been sort of partners in crime, and a lot of the conversations about these topics, not just with myself, but with other researchers, a lot of conversations and analyses and long discussions that I think I hope I'll able to properly represent as I lead you all through these various discussions. So, the ABCD study, the Adolescent Brain Cognitive Development Study, represents a unique and unprecedented resource for understanding brain development. With almost 12,000 participants that were followed longitudinally from ages 9 to 10 through young adulthood, this ABCD study offers a comprehensive set of neuroimaging, genetic, behavioral, and environmental data, right? Which now sort of allows a remarkable opportunity for a number of discoveries. And because this is an open access data sets, researchers around the world can access these data. And so this is revolutionary. We're not really just limited to studies from single labs or institutions. Anyone with appropriate training and data use approval can investigate a number of questions about adolescent brain development using this rich resource. But with great power comes great responsibility. When we work with data from over 11,000 real children and families, right, representing a number of racial and ethnic backgrounds, socioeconomic circumstances, and lived experiences, our methodological choices matter enormously. How we conceptualize demographic variables, how we interpret group differences, and how we communicate our findings can either advance scientific understanding in ways that benefit communities, or it could perpetuate harmful misconceptions and reinforce existing disparities. We've seen in a number of ways how neuroimaging research involving demographic variables can be misinterpreted, sometimes with findings being used to suggest innate differences between groups or to justify existing inequalities, even when researchers don't intend these interpretations. Imprecise language or inadequate theoretical framing or conventional statistical practices can create opportunities for misuse. So we face a critical challenge. How do we leverage the ABCD study to advance knowledge while ensuring our research practices are methodologically rigorous, scientifically sound, and socially responsible? How do we study important questions about health disparities and environmental influences on development without perpetuating stereotypes or causing harm? Well, today I want to walk through one attempt at doing this using the following framework. This new framework that I'm proposing and presenting today is called REFLECT. It's a systematic approach to responsible research practices when working with large-scale neuroimaging datasets that include diverse populations and demographic variables. Now, this framework emerges from conversations among ABCD researchers and users, different community partners, and experts in a number of fields, such as developmental cognitive neuroscience, social drivers of health, and research ethics. We hope that it synthesizes recent guidance from leading journals and scientific organizations with practical implementation strategies specific to large-scale neuroimaging research. So each element here represents a critical domain where we need to reflect carefully on our research practices. Throughout this lecture, I'll walk through each component in detail and provide both principles and practical implementations for guidance. I'll also share some ABCD-specific considerations and common pitfalls to avoid. This lecture is designed to be a resource that you can return to as you work with ABCD data or similar datasets, so feel free to pause, rewind, or jump to specific sections as needed. So let's begin with the first element here, representation and sample considerations. The first element of Reflect is representation, that is, critically evaluating participant recruitment, retention, and how we construct demographic categories. So the core principle here is that we need to carefully examine who's included in our studies, who is excluded, and how we categorize and interpret demographic information. So it's not just about describing our sample, it's about understanding the implications of our sampling decisions for generalizability and scientific validity. So in the context of the ABCD study specifically, the ABCD study recruited over 11,800 children ages 9 and 10 at baseline from 21 sites across the United States. The study used school-based recruitment to approximate the demographic diversity of the U.S. population. However, representative doesn't mean that every analysis using ABCD data will have a representative sample. So some key recommendations here. First, document your recruitment strategies and assess potential selection effects. Now, if you're an ABCD user, you didn't collect this data yourself. So this means understanding both the original study recruitment and your own analytical sample. Who did you include? Who did you exclude? And what were your inclusion criteria? Second, report demographic details transparently with attention to intersecting social categories. So it's not enough to say diverse ABCD sample. You need to report specific numbers for race, ethnicity, socioeconomic indicators, and ideally how these intersect. For instance, reporting race, ethnicity, and family income allows readers to understand your sample composition more fully. Third, clearly state the populations to whom findings can and cannot be generalized. So if your analytical sample overrepresents certain groups or excludes others due to missing data or quality control, just acknowledge this as explicitly as you can. Because your findings may not generalize to populations underrepresented in your sample. And finally, it's really important to examine patterns of missing data that may relate to participant characteristics. And I'll go over an example of this in the next slide. When you run a longitudinal study, you may encounter this selection bias that occurs as the study goes on, right? So there may be differences between the participants that initially enrolled in the study, and as the study goes on, those participants who were able to attend every visit and those who missed at least one visit or more than one visit, right? And so this selection bias, as you go on with the study, kind of limits the generalizability of what your analyses can kind of say, right? Since these findings may reflect a subset of these participants rather than those entire, in the case of ABCD, those entire 11,800 plus participants. And that is one thing that a number of ABCD researchers have found as they followed this cohort as time goes on, is that in general, loss to follow-up tends to be more pronounced among the less advantaged and less healthy. So this leads to a sample that looks healthier and wealthier than the real population the further on that you go in the study. And, we anticipate that because each year the remaining sample represents the real population less and less. So when you're working with year 2, year 3, or later data of the ABCD study, you need to make sure that you examine who remained in your study versus who was lost to follow-up. And consider whether these attrition patterns, those that dropped off, are related to any of your key variables of interest. And it's really important to acknowledge that how this affects the generalizability, right? Who does this speak to in your data? So be really cautious about longitudinal conclusions that you might make that might be biased by the selective attrition that may be happening as a study goes on. One topic that often comes up related to this element of representation is that of how is it that we code for race and ethnicity in our studies. And so what I wanted to do is I wanted to walk through an example of one such coding approach that has been popular with many ABCD studies that specifically of that race underscore ethnicity variable that at least existed in earlier ABCD releases to illustrate the number of choices that researchers may make in creating these variables and some pros and cons, some strengths and limitations of these decisions, because they can be very important in what we're saying and communicating if you're using such variables. So in the ABCD study, at least for the baseline time point, caregivers were asked two questions relevant to the participant, which could have been their child or at least the child that they came in with. So the first question was, what is the race, either your race or the race of your of your child? And people were able to make selections of all that applied in this long list. The second question was, what is your ethnicity, which essentially asked Hispanic or non-Hispanic or Latino. And so based on the responses to those questions, responses were then coded into the following categories. And these were exclusive sort of categories where people were kind of allocated to one of these levels. And so the first one was if the person answered yes to Hispanic or Latino, they were coded as Hispanic. And then based on those that that responded no to Hispanic, people were then put into categories based on their response to the race question. And so you ended up with these categories where people were assigned to either Hispanic or Latino or non-Hispanic white, non-Hispanic Black or African American, non-Hispanic Asian, or this other non-Hispanic multiracial or other category. So this ends up being a combined ethno-racial construct that's consistent with a number of census categories that are often used. However, this approach has significant limitations, which you may quickly notice. So the first one is, what does it mean to have this other category? What does it mean to put it in your models or to have it in your tables? How do you interpret anything that may come significant or that you may want to discuss when it is a very heterogeneous group that is essentially sort of what is left over, quote unquote, from not having been selected in the other categories. Another thing that you may notice too is that having this multiracial other category and lumping everybody together essentially combines multiracial youth with American Indian, Alaska Native, Native Hawaiian, Pacific Islander, and other categories, which renders many of these specific populations invisible in not only most analyses, but also many discussions broadly. And so it reminds us that these census categories, these decisions that we make in coding that may come from these census categories are subject to, sociopolitical and historical context and the biases or the biases or choices that different researchers may make. Now, one thing is that you might ask, with all of these limitations, and why might this coding scheme be useful? And so sometimes researchers may be wanting to compare estimates to other census-derived effects and describe population-level trends using these same categories. Although, as we'll discuss later, not just because something has been done over and over should it mean that you should stick with those decisions. But also sometimes, although one may want to include all of these different categories in your analyses, sometimes having very small cell sizes or small sum samples for some of these categories risk the identifiability of participants. And another reason why people might use this coding scheme of combining race and ethnicity together into this combined construct in this way is that it can be helpful in accounting for Hispanic or Latino individuals that may not necessarily feel represented when asked to report their race. And so they may sometimes report I don't knows or other things when responding to this race category. And so combining combining the responses from these two questions may help with some of that either missingness or I don't know sort of responses. But that being said, the limitations of this combined ethno-racial construct, even if they might be useful, should be acknowledged, right? In addition to to its limitations and the assumptions that you are making in making these choices. So for coding race and ethnicity, there is no perfect solution. So just try your best. And at least in the newest ABCD data release, there are now not just one race ethnicity variable. There are now a number of them to reflect a number of conditions and assumptions in coding approaches. So you should explore and read through all of them and the documentation to see which one best fits your research question and approach. And so for all of these, you should, in your papers and discussions and analyses, you should justify your coding approach based on your research question and in that report which categories you combined and why. Also acknowledge which populations are obscured by your coding choices so as to not contribute to this invisibility of particular sort of identities and groups. And also consider whether your coding scheme enhances or hinders understanding of the question or the focus that you're or what you're trying to communicate in your studies. And as always, being able to talk to other communities or other researchers or other collaborators can kind of help to illuminate what that means, right? What does it mean to enhance or hinder sort of understanding of what you're trying to do and communicate? And overall, for this for this representation element, a common pitfall to avoid here is that of inadequate sample description. So, just reporting that you used the ABCD sample without providing demographic details or combining multiple distinct groups into another category without explanation is something that you want to avoid. Because this erasure of specific population isn't just problematic ethically; it's scientifically problematic and limiting. We can't understand the scope and limits of our findings without clear sample characterization. So now moving on to the next element, and that is of the E in reflect, the first E in reflect, environmental factors as primary explanations. So in the second element, the focus is on environmental factors, specifically prioritizing the measurement of environmental and social drivers when examining differences between demographic groups. Now, when we observe differences between demographic groups in any of our analyses, our first question should not be, what is different about these groups, but rather, what different environments have these individuals experienced? Now, this framing is crucial because demographic categories like race and ethnicity are social constructs. That means that they're what they specifically mean is subject to a number of elements, and they don't have biological meaning in and of themselves. They serve as markers for different lived experiences shaped by social, historical, and structural processes. If we find any differences, particularly if we're looking at any sort of like brain feature, and it's that difference is associated with demographic groups, those differences really reflect environmental and broad influences and not innate biological properties of these groups. So a few key recommendations of this element here. So first is to use direct measurement of environmental variables whenever possible, instead of kind of relying on just these sociodemographic variables as proxies for them. And so ABCD has a large number of variables that can be helpful in trying to characterize these specific environmental variables instead of these broader sort of racial or sociodemographic proxies. And so one example is the linked external data available through ABCD. And so these are variables that are based on geocoded residential addresses and can provide, neighborhood level information about all sorts of domains, such as amenities and services, what kind of social dynamics may be existing at sort of this aggregate level, other sort of exposures like air pollution, the presence of green space, and even some things that are much more upstream, such as different laws that may be present in some locations versus others. And so there's another lecture that focuses on linked external data given by Dr. Megan Herding. And so I encourage you to listen/watch that lecture to get more sort of details on the number of variables that may be represented here that could be useful for your analyses using ABCD data. A couple of notes related to this recommendation is, as I mentioned before, is that whenever possible, instead of using race as a proxy for neighborhood, either disadvantage or deprivation, try to measure the actual neighborhood characteristics that you may be discussing in your system or model directly. And so one example of how you can do this, right, is that instead of reporting, black youth showed different patterns than white youth, you might be able to find something that's more specific, such as, youth living in neighborhoods with higher air pollution and fewer green spaces show different patterns, and these environmental factors explain the demographic differences that we initially observed. Another recommendation here is to consider the broader social context of development. Development is shaped by varied social, cultural, and environmental context, and youth adapt to their environments in ways that influence their developmental trajectories. And so we as researchers must evaluate whether the data that we're using in our analyses adequately capture these contextual factors. And we should acknowledge that development is a dynamic process, right? That's influenced by the potential for adaptation and change, and consider the complexity of all of these individual experiences. Instead of just thinking about a one-size-fits-all sort of model. There are a number of factors to consider, different dynamics and different environments that may be at play during this time in your studies, right? So some of this could be the age and stage of development, cognitive and emotional developmental processes, the influence of peers, and also the family environment, school environments, neighborhood and community environments, and even some things that may be a bit more upstream or broader, such as media, social media, different cultural or social norms, and also even things that may be related to socioeconomic status and access to resources, which are not just, although measured sometimes in individual spaces, are kind of reflective of greater socioeconomic systems. Not thinking about these contextual or environmental sort of factors and solely focusing on individual factors can really limit not only your studies, but also the statements that you're trying to make and the findings that you're trying to find. So because they can oversimplify the issue by just very much focusing on the person and what they might do instead of putting this into a greater context. It also may contribute to deficit-based views, right? As we sort of try to identify where things may be happening or which factors might be associated, it may be possible that instead of pointing the finger, so to speak, at sort of these broader sort of environmental factors, we may be sort of pointing the finger at sort of individuals in how we've set up our models, right? In addition to also flattening all these very complex pathways, which then also makes it very difficult to identify points of intervention if, again, we're not necessarily thinking about the right context or the right environment, right, and just focusing on what we can sort of see and look at relative to the individual. So for this element, the big pitfall to avoid, right, is these making these assumptions with these proxy variables and using these demographic categories as shortcuts for unmeasured environmental factors. So one example in which this happens is that people may include race in a model and assume that it captures everything else we didn't measure about social experience. This is very imprecise, right? It can lead to misinterpretation, right? And so one thing to kind of communicate to you as you think about these issues is that when you don't tell the story, somebody else will, right? So race doesn't cause brain differences. Environmental factors associated with how people are racialized in society, right? This could be discrimination, differential resource access, chronic stress exposure. Those are actually the mechanisms that lead to these sort of differences in behavior or development. And so in ABCD, many of these can be measured directly. So there's no excuse in many often for using these as especially race and ethnicity as these proxies. So now moving on to the third element of this reflect framework, and that is on focusing on framing and theoretical foundations. In this element, we focus on framing, that is, grounding research in established scientific frameworks that recognize demographic categories as complex social phenomena. How we conceptualize and understand demographic variables fundamentally shapes every downstream sort of decision interpretation in our research. If we were to think of race as a biological variable, we design and interpret our studies very differently than if we were to understand them as a social category reflecting historical and ongoing social processes. And this choice of framing isn't just semantic, it has profound implications for our models, interpretations, and conclusions. So some key recommendations here, the first of which is to define race and ethnicity and other sociodemographics as socially constructed categories and not biological variables. And this is something that needs to be explicit in your papers, and you should try to mention these in the introduction or early in your method section. Here's an example of what that might look like. So just reading from what's on the slide here. So race and ethnicity are social constructed categories whose meaning arise from historical and contemporary social and political processes. Observed associations between these categories and health outcomes reflect differential environmental exposures, social experiences, and access to resources shaped by structural factors, not innate biological differences. Now, don't assume that your readers will infer this or bring this in with them. You should really state it clearly. As I mentioned before, if you're not stating this, somebody else, if there's ever any ambiguity, somebody else will fill that information in for you. Another recommendation is to consider established social science theoretical frameworks. Work explaining the complex multi-level processes associated with these sociodemographics has been going on for decades. And so it has gone by, you can find it by a number of names, but I just have some listed up here. So, social determinants or drivers of health models, life course development theory, ecological systems theory, population health science approaches also exist out there. And this is just this figure here is just an example from a paper by Maribel Reblota-Gonzalez and other researchers that walk through a number of these different frameworks, specifically in the ABCD study, and talk about how a number of these complex multi-level sort of processes that may be happening here that give rise to give rise and meaning to these sociodemographic variables, and here very relevant to health disparities work. So another recommendation here is just acknowledging how historical policies and social processes shape current population patterns and how they impact the work that you are doing. Things such as housing segregation, educational funding disparities, differential access to healthcare, environmental racism are not random patterns. They're the results of specific policies and practices that have shaped who lives where and who has access to what resources. And so your introduction should provide this context, which is going to vary depending on the construct that you're looking at. Another important recommendation is to distinguish clearly between demographic categories, cultural practices, and genetic ancestry. These are related, but distinct concepts that shouldn't be conflated together. Now, although we could spend hours and many, many lectures discussing the specifics of each one of these, broadly, race and ethnicity are social categories. Culture refers to practices, beliefs, and values, and genetic ancestry is about population genetics. They're not the same thing, and so we need to be precise about which we're discussing here. And so, specifically for this last point about genetic ancestry and population genetics, there is a really nice report by the National Academy of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine that discusses sort of these differences and nuances very well, and specifically tackles the use of population descriptors and how they should and should not be used in genetics and genomics research. And so, one specific thing about this NASEM report on population descriptors and genomics research is that it asserts that race is neither useful nor scientifically valid as a measure of the structure of human genetic variation. So again, although genetic variation can be important for characterizing population level genetics, these race and ethnicity contemporary labels should not be used interchangeably with those there. Now, big pitfall to avoid here. So, treating demographic variables as biological factors, this happens more often than we might think. When we include race in in an analysis without a theoretical framework and without measuring environmental influences, we're implicitly treating it as if it were a biological variable that directly influences either brain structure or some other sort of process. And so we need to be explicit. When talking about these demographic groups or demographic factors, we're studying the sort of underlying social processes here, processes that have been shaped by historical and structural factors, and how those influence development through different measurable environmental pathways. Now, moving on to the next element here, and that is language and scientific communication. So, when talking about language and scientific communication, this is referring to using precise, scientifically and accurate language as much as possible that appropriately represents the complexity of social categories. Words matter, right? So the language that we use shapes how our findings are understood, both by other scientists and by the public that consumes our work, right? And so imprecise and often deficit-focused language can perpetuate stereotypes and cause harm, even when that's not our intent, right? So as scientists, we have a responsibility to communicate carefully and precisely as much as possible. So the first recommendation here is to, try to adopt asset-based or strength-based approaches. That is those that can focus on resilience and adaptive capacity instead of just the deficit models or the risk-based models that we may be really accustomed to using. And another way of thinking about this, right, is that, when thinking about different socioeconomic groups, right, instead of asking, going to this first question of what is wrong with this group, trying to ask and frame as much as possible, how is it that individuals and communities thrive despite challenges? And some people may say that this is trying to be politically correct, but it's not about being politically correct and whatever that means. But it's about scientific accuracy and trying to think about strengths and not just these deficits or risks. Similar to what I mentioned before, another recommendation is just as much as possible trying to maintain the scientific precision, right? Clearly trying to distinguish between things like race, ethnicity, culture, and genetic ancestry in your writing, as using them interchangeably really creates confusion. A third recommendation is to avoid using demographic categories as proxies for unmeasured variables. And specifically in this case, I mean, it happens a lot in the literature that people might say that we're, quote unquote, controlling for race, right? And what does that necessarily mean, right? And so the recommendation here is to not write, we controlled for race when what you really mean is that you attempted to account for complex environmental and social factors that may differ across these demographic groups. When we say controlled for race, what is it that you're controlling for necessarily? Another recommendation is to use descriptive rather than categorical language when possible. And this is using person first language. So instead of labeling individuals and using adjectives, describe their circumstances or experiences. Now, I want to show a few examples here of some of these recommendations and what they actually mean in application, right? So one example is that going back to this last recommendation, instead of saying, disadvantaged populations, you can instead say participants experiencing socioeconomic disadvantage or whatever sort of mechanism or phenomenon you're talking about, right? The second version here describes the circumstances rather than labeling people and populations. Another example, just touching on some of these recommendations, is that instead of saying racial differences in brain volume, you can say differences in brain volume associated with social processes that vary by demographic groups. The second version here acknowledges the social mechanisms rather than attributing the cause to race itself and implying that it has sort of this like biological relevance. Instead of saying, for the third example here, instead of saying after controlling for race, you can say, you can think about whether it's more appropriate to say including demographic variables and models. And so the second version here is more precise about what you actually did. Again, when we say controlling for race, what does that necessarily mean? What are you accounting for? And how are you using race in that example there? And just another example here is, instead of saying vulnerable populations, you can say populations experiencing systematic barriers to health and facing structural disadvantage. Again, this second version identifies external causes rather than suggesting sort of this inherent sort of vulnerability for these populations. The major pitfall here to avoid is deficit-focused interpretation, automatically interpreting group differences as impairments. When we find differences, we need to ask ourselves, are we describing what we observed, or are we making value judgments about what may be normal? Are we considering alternative explanations? Moving on to the next element here, and that's evaluation of methodological choices. And so, by talking about evaluation, we refer to critically examining our statistical and analytical decisions for potential bias, because every methodological choice that we make has implications. And so we need to interrogate our default practices and ask whether they serve our scientific goals or whether they reflect unchallenged conventions that we may have, which may introduce bias or lead to misinterpretation. So some key recommendations here, first of which is to provide theoretical rationale for including demographic variables in your models. Don't just include them because that's just what we always do, or because you assume that your reviewers are expecting it and you want to play it safe. Before you add race and ethnicity or any demographic variable to your model, these are some questions that you can ask yourself. The first one being, what construct does this variable represent in my model? What am I testing by including it? And what are my theoretical assumptions here? And, this might be strongly worded here, but, if you can't articulate clear answers for these, you should probably not include it, right? Because you're running the risk of it being misinterpreted if you're not if you're not specifically illustrating what you mean by it. And it may be a sign that you may need to do more conceptual work before including it in your model. Second key recommendation here is to question your use of default reference group. Right. One of the things that we often do when using these race ethnicity variables is that we may dummy code race with white as the reference category. And so, really think about what that is doing for your model and for the interpretations that you're making. Because by using white as the reference category, you're implicitly positioning, whiteness in this category as the norm and all the other groups as deviation from that norm. Because this model is literally producing coefficients that mean difference from white participants. And is that what you're intent to communicate? Often it may not be, and it may just be what statistical software or the conventions that you're talking about do by default. So just some alternatives to consider, right, when thinking about the sociodemographic variables in your analysis. Could be effects coding, which compares each group to the grand mean rather than to a reference group. You could also separate or stratify the models by group if you have theoretical reasons to expect different processes in different population, or consider mixture modeling or some latent variable approach to identify subgroups that may not necessarily map onto these demographic categories. And so I recommend considering these alternatives, especially when your research question isn't specifically about comparing these groups to your reference categories. Another recommendation here is to evaluate measurement tools and exclusion criteria for potential bias. This is particularly important with in neuroimaging, as standard quality control procedures like excluding data of a certain motion threshold, for example, can disproportionately exclude certain demographic groups. And there has been some research that has shown that Black and Hispanic youth are more likely to be excluded based on these motion criteria. And this can create a biased sample where the remaining participants don't represent the full demographic distribution. So some other things to consider here, particularly in the case of neuroimaging, right, is to be looking at whether, is to make sure to report exclusion rates by demographic group, and thinking whether our QC criteria are too stringent, as this can contribute to this bias. Use statistical approaches that account for motion rather than just excluding data. And acknowledge how these exclusions affect your generalizability. And one really big recommendation here is to read available data warnings and responsible use flags, because there are many of these that are available for ABCD study variables. The Deep Data Dictionary lists all domains and all variables, and the wiki provides important data use information that will be updated over time. And so this, I just have an image here of just what snapshot of what that looks like. And so you may see data warning flags, such as this one here in yellow, that indicate measurement or data quality issues. But you could also see these responsible data use flags, responsible use warnings here shown in red, that highlights variables that require special care and interpretation or reporting. For example, some sensitive variables have responsible use flags to remind researchers to consider either privacy or potential stigmatization or appropriate contextual interpretation. And so when you're selecting variables for your analyses, you should really check deep for these flags and read the descriptions carefully. These flags have been curated by a number of researchers, and they exist for good reasons, as ignoring them can lead to misinterpretation or harm. And here I just want to show you an example of what you might see here, right? So this here is what you would see for caregivers partnership and employment status variable, and you can see that there's a little yellow triangle, and so if you hover over that yellow triangle, you can follow up and see that there's a data quality warning and see the details associated with that. And so, you know, clicking on that will allow you to see even more details about what that looks like. So if you follow that through and click that there, you'll see something like this for this variable. And so I won't read through all of it, but as you can see, there's extensive documentation there that illustrates sort of what that, for that variable, what sort of measurement sort of issues may be present. Now, just showing you an example of a responsible data use warning here. So this is a variable that's just showing the mean weight for youth here. And so you can see that there's a little red circle there. And so if you hover over that, you'll see that it says that there's a responsible data use warning. And if you click on that and follow it through, you'll be able to see a longer entry here, sort of that's discussing here much more information about this variable here. And sometimes you can see both of them present for a variable, as is the case here for this household income question. So as you can see here, there's both a circle and a triangle, which means that there's a data use warning and also a responsible data use warning. And so And I won't read through them. I'll leave those for you. But this is what the content would look like for both of those questions. So I definitely recommend, if people are using household income, but for all of your variables, to read through the documentation and read through the nitty gritty considerations and measurement issues that may be present in the variables that you're using. Okay, so moving along to the next element here, which is the C in reflect, which is community engagement and stakeholder consultation. And so here we're talking about incorporating relevant community perspectives and stakeholder input to enhance the research validity and societal benefit. So research doesn't happen in a vacuum, especially as we're talking about people, right? It doesn't just happen within your computer. It also involves the communities that we study, and they have expertise about their own experiences. And so involving them in the research process can really improve both the quality of the science and its relevance for addressing real world concerns. And so I won't say much more about this because I recommend that you see Dr. Maribel Robledo Gonzalez's presentation for an in-depth dive on community engagement and how that can look like even when you're doing secondary data analysis using the ABCD study data. So for our last element here, the T in reflect stands for transparency and accountability. And so when talking about transparency and accountability, we're talking about maintaining openness about methodological choices and taking ongoing responsibility for research practices and their impacts. So good science requires honesty about what we did, what we found, and what the limitations are. But beyond transparency, we need accountability. That's taking responsibility for how our research is interpreted and used, and committing to continuous improvement of our practices. So just some recommendations here. So first is to document all the coding decisions and analytical choices that you make. This can include things that we've mentioned before, but how you coded race and ethnicity and why, what other coding schemes you considered, which variables you selected from the hundreds, thousands that are available, how you handled missing data, what quality control criteria you applied. This could be a lot, right? And much of this can go in supplemental materials if the journal space is limited. But you do want to make it available to readers who want to understand your exact procedures, because just like you, there are a lot of people that are using the ABCD study data. So I want to point you to a resource, a paper that may be helpful in thinking about what you should include in your paper to be most useful to all of the people, to the thousands and thousands of people that are using the ABCD data. And so this paper, led by Daniel Lopez and Rebecca Huber, who I mentioned earlier in my talk, reviewed 549 articles. That was the number of articles that were using ABCD data that were published at the time, and just examined the different reporting practices of all these different papers and how the data had been used. And so in that paper, you can see a number of recommendations that suggest, as you can see in this table here, what things you should include. And so there's some things that I already talked about, right, such as like missing data, because all of these are very useful to other people. So if you want to maximize, the utility of what you're including in your papers, I definitely suggest checking this out. Another recommendation that I talked about a little bit before, but is to clearly articulate your study limitations. And so for ABCD studies, some limitations that come up often could include, that your sample composition may not represent all populations equally, this attrition and this bias that may occur as you look at later time points, exclusions based on data quality that can create selection bias, inability to make causal claims from observational data, and just the measurement limitations of specific instruments. And so be very specific about the limitations and their implications for interpretation. Also be transparent about confidence levels and effect sizes, right? Just because your result is statistically significant, it doesn't necessarily mean that that is practically important. And so it's really important to report these effect sizes and confidence intervals so readers can judge the magnitude and precision of effects and compare them to other studies, et cetera, et cetera. Another recommendation here is, as much as you can anticipate and address potential misunderstandings, try to address them explicitly in your papers, in your discussions. If your findings could be misinterpreted in harmful ways, for example, if there's any way in which you could be suggesting, innate group differences, just try to address them as much as possible in your discussion section. And this is easier said than done, but sharing your work, talking to other collaborators can definitely bring up any potential spots that could be misunderstood and therefore allow you to address them proactively as much as possible. Now, as I mentioned before, this element is not just about transparency, but also accountability, which means taking ongoing responsibility. So some recommendations here on accountability. So one thing you can do is conduct a regular self-assessment using some of these reflect principles that I've been talking about, right? So at any point in the process. So you could do this after completing an analysis or a manuscript and just going through sort of these different reflect elements and think about, did I adequately examine representation? Did I prioritize sort of these environmental factors instead of focusing on just sort of the individual? Was my theoretical framing clear? Was I precise in my language? Are there places where I may not have been as precise? Did I thoroughly justify my methodological choices? Did I engage with the communities that I was talking about appropriately? And was I transparent about my limitations? The recommendation here for accountability is just respond especially once your findings are communicated out into the world, just to respond to community and peer feedback as much as possible. Be open to that criticism and willing to change, which can be easier said than done, but really important, especially for, this responsible use in communication. And it is true that the field is evolving rapidly as we understand best practices, as social dynamics change. And so one thing that's really important to think about, that I like to think about often, is, thinking a lot about epistemic humility. And so epistemic humility being this conscious awareness of the limits and fallibility of one's own knowledge. And just, not just thinking that you're going to be always right, but being open to new information and different perspectives. How can you learn from the things that others may be pointing out about what you're doing, and not being so defensive, right? Especially because, and not just ABCD work, but in a lot of work, right? It's a lot of people from different fields coming together in this interdisciplinary way. And so being open to what other disciplines may be saying or interpreting based on what you're saying is really important. And so this kind of going with that, is it's a commitment to ongoing learning. What's considered best practice today may evolve. What I just mentioned, and all, as you are listening to a lot of the recommendations or thoughts that I may be posing, you may already be thinking that the conversation has shifted and it now needs to consider additional elements, right? So really important to stay current with methodological developments and be willing to update your approaches as those changes come. Also important to take responsibility for how research findings are interpreted and used. When your work is misinterpreted in media or, maybe cited to justify harmful policies, try to speak up as much as possible and correct the record, right? And this may be difficult sometimes. As a junior person, right? But there are often other collaborators, more senior sort of people. Everybody has a place and a role, right? And so trying as much as possible to speak up when sort of these misinterpretation may happen, right? And as much as possible, get ahead and tell your story before someone does it for you. And just a final recommendation here, also about, what you sign up to do and being accountable for those things, is to include required acknowledgments. So as part of the duck that everybody signs, right, there are some agreements that we make. And so Important to include these acknowledgments, and these include, I have them all here. So there's on the left, the standard ABCD study acknowledgement text, which includes funding acknowledgments, also includes, mention to the DOI for the specific data release that you use, but also importantly, an acknowledgement of the ABCD participants and families. Right. And so you can always look to, your data use certificate, but also the ABCD study website to make sure that you're up to date with those. And this isn't just, bureaucratic compliance, right? It's accountability to the study infrastructure and the participants who have made this research possible. So, don't treat it as just boilerplate, but think of it as a meaningful acknowledgement of the contribution and support here. So now we've gone through all of the different elements of this reflect framework, right? And so just want to say a few final things about this. So reflect is a practice, is not perfection here, right? This reflect framework isn't just a checklist. It's intended to be a systematic approach to, reflexive, rigorous research practice. Each element here asks us to pause and think critically about decisions that we might otherwise make automatically or by convention. Right. And so, just being honest with you, right, implementing these reflect sort of elements does require more intentionality and effort up front than just following standard practices or a simple checklist, right? And some of you might be thinking, this seems like a lot of work on top of everything else that I need to do. And you're right. You're right. It does require a lot more intentionality and thoughtful engagement. But I would say that, this is important for really good science, right? One can, as one adjusts and starts thinking about these things, they may feel as burdens because there's a learning curve, all these. But do you think that they're fundamental to conducting research in a way that's both scientifically rigorous and also socially responsible? One thing that I can say, as someone that's been thinking and, talking and discussing and sometimes arguing about these issues with people so often, is that, implementing these reflect sort of elements and principle does get easier with practice, right? The first time that you work through these considerations explicitly, it can feel slow, right? Because you're questioning everything. But over time, these reflexive practices become integrated in how you naturally think about research from the very beginning. Eventually asking, what environmental factors should I measure can become as automatic as asking, like, what's my sample size, right? And so considering how language might be misinterpreted really becomes part of your writing process, not necessarily an extra step. But it does take a little bit of time to get there. I also want to emphasize that this reflect sort of framework and responsible data use considerations broadly, they're about continuous improvement, not perfection, right? So, I don't think none of us will really implement every single element perfectly in every study. I look back to so many papers that I just wrote and I'm like, ooh, I would have maybe done that differently now. I definitely have those moments each and every single time. But, the goal is progress, right? The goal is that you're more thoughtful and intentional in every project and every analysis than the last one that you did. And so you can kind of use this reflect framework as a diagnostic tool, right? After each analysis or manuscript, taking some time to go through these different elements and identifying areas where you did well, right? And areas where you can improve can be really important. This practice on this metacognitive practice, how you reflect on your own process is how we grow as scientists. So I'm getting to the end of what I was planning to talk to you all about, right? And so I thank you for getting this far and watching this lecture, whether it was a 2x speed because there was so much content. And so just some other things that I wanted to mention is that there are, in the lecture slides that accompany this talk, there are additional frequently asked questions that I've been asked a lot, that come up often in talking about responsible use. And so I definitely recommend checking those out at the end of the lecture slides, just to answer some questions like, oh my God, one of the questions, like, how do I get started? This is really overwhelming. Or like, what if reviewers and editors push back on this, right? So I definitely definitely invite you to check those out. And also, I welcome your feedback on this framework. The purpose of putting all this forward is not just to preach at you for many minutes at a time, but the hope is that this can be helpful for you and your teams as you navigate different large data neuroscience analyses such as those with ABCD. So just leaving you with one last thought, which is just remember, thoughtful, reflexive research practice isn't extra work. It really is about, creating reproducible, rigorous, good science. And so finally, I just want to acknowledge a number of people because it's not just me. There's a lot of people that contributed and made possible just me being able to talk at you for all these minutes, right? So I want to acknowledge you and the ReproNim community, which has enabled a lot of these conversations. A lot of National Institute, which have provided a lot of funding for a lot of the spaces in which we've been able to have a lot of these conversations, right? And also shout out to my home institutions, to my home institution and some of the centers that have supported me there. Importantly, the ABCD study participants and their families and the many comrades and pals in the ABCD consortium that have had a number of these conversations with me. And so with that said, I sign off, but I wish you the best of luck with all of your ABCD study analyses.